I want to start with a lithograph, not a famous one. You won't find it in any standard history of urban development or civil engineering. I came across it in the collection of a Belgian architectural historian whose estate was settled in 2011 and whose papers, largely uncatalogued, were deposited with a regional archive outside Ghent. The archivist who helped me locate it described it as miscellaneous printed material. It had been filed between a set of municipal drainage surveys from the 1840s and a property dispute record from 1863. The lithograph shows a city's skyline. The city is not identified on the print itself, but based on the architectural details and the style of the street level figures, the historian whose collection it came from had penciled a note on the back: Brussels established 1847. The skyline is extraordinary, not because it is beautiful, although it is, not because of the density or the scale, but because of what is on the rooftops. Every major building, every civic hall, every church, every institution of apparent significance has a tower, and not merely a decorative spire. What you see when you look at this lithograph carefully are structures at the apex of each tower that appear to serve a function. Metal elements, pointed, elaborate, connected, in the illustration at least, to what appear to be conduits running down the sides of the buildings, frameworks, systems. I showed the lithograph to an architectural historian. He said it was a typical representation of Pre-Haussmann European civic architecture. I showed it to an electrical engineer. He said nothing for a long time. Let me tell you what we're taught about the history of electricity. We're taught it begins in the latter half of the 19th century. Franklin's lightning rod, Volta's battery, Faraday's discovery of electromagnetic induction, Edison's practical incandescent bulb in 1879, the first electrical grid, Pearl Street Station, New York, 1882. We're taught this is the origin point, the moment humanity first learned to harness electricity for practical use. Before that, candles. Before that, fire. A clean line from darkness to light. This is the story. Here's the thing about the story. It requires us to accept that the enormous metal structures on the rooftops of virtually every major building on Earth in the pre-1860 world were there for no functional reason. That the copper-tipped finials, the iron spires, the elaborate rooftop elements documented in photograph after photograph, lithograph after lithograph, survey after survey, in cities that had no systematic communication with one another, were purely decorative, purely symbolic, the products of independent aesthetic traditions that happened independently to arrive at the same solution: tall, metal-tipped, vertically maximized structures at the apex of every significant building, connected to internal frameworks that ran through the walls and floors and ceilings, and terminated at fixtures in every major room. This raises a simple but critical question. What exactly were all those structures for? I need to be precise about what I'm describing because the scope of it is easy to underestimate. I'm not talking about one city. I'm not talking about one architectural tradition. I'm not talking about one era. I'm talking about a consistent worldwide pattern spanning centuries. The great civic buildings of medieval Europe, the temple complexes of Southeast Asia, the ceremonial architecture of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the public buildings of the early American Republic, the institutional structures of colonial cities in Africa and India, all of them with the same basic feature: a tall, carefully constructed vertical element, a metal component at its apex, and, in the buildings where the interior has been examined carefully, a network of conductive material running through the structure itself. The official explanation is lightning protection. Benjamin Franklin. The lightning rod. Simple, elegant, rational. But here's the thing about lightning rods. They are grounded. Their function depends entirely on a continuous conductive path from the tip of the spike down the exterior of the building and into the earth. The charge is dissipated. That is the mechanism. That is the entire point. And yet, in building after building, in city after city, the internal metal networks documented by restorers, surveyors and structural engineers in the 19th and early 20th centuries were not grounded in any meaningful sense. They were connected upward. They ran from rooftop elements into walls, into floors, into ceiling fixtures, not down and out, through and in. Let me give you a specific example. In 1853, a team of engineers surveying the structural condition of the Hôtel de Ville in Paris, the great civic hall that anchors the administrative centre of the city, produced a report that survives in the French National Archive, classified under Public Building Assessments of the Second Republic. The report notes, with evident puzzlement, the presence of an internal metal framework that does not correspond to any known structural requirement. The framework runs, in the engineer's description, from rooftop elements, which they categorise as decorative, through the building's primary walls via channels that appear to have been designed into the original construction, not added later, and terminates at what the report describes as anchor points of unknown function in several of the building's major interior spaces. The engineers recommended further investigation. No further investigation was conducted. The report was filed. The Hôtel de Ville was extensively renovated in the decade that followed. The internal framework was removed during renovation. The renovation records describe its removal as the clearing of obsolete metalwork. Obsolete. That word appears again and again. In renovation records, in demolition permits, in the correspondence of city engineers and building administrators across the 1860s, 1870s and 1880s. Obsolete metalwork, outdated iron systems, redundant conductive infrastructure. The language is consistent, the language is specific, and the language, if you read it carefully, presupposes a function. You cannot make infrastructure obsolete unless it was serving a purpose that something else now serves better, or a purpose that someone has decided should no longer be served at all. This raises a simple but critical question. Obsolete for what? The deeper I went into this, the more a specific timeline began to emerge. The towers and rooftop systems I'm describing were not removed overnight. The removal unfolded over roughly 30 years, concentrated in the period between 1860 and 1895. And the mechanism of the removal in city after city follows a pattern that is almost too consistent to be coincidence. First, the building is classified as outdated, not structurally unsound, not dangerous, outdated. The classification appears in official records but is almost never supported by engineering documentation. The buildings being classified as outdated are in many cases the grandest, most robustly constructed civic structures in their cities, structures that had stood for 50, 100, in some cases 200 years. Second, a renovation or demolition is authorised. In many cases, renovation, not demolition. The building survives. What doesn't survive is the rooftop infrastructure. Third, the rooftop elements are removed, sometimes melted down, sometimes described in records as transferred to other uses, and then the record goes quiet. No further mention, no explanation of where the materials went, what the other uses were, why specifically the rooftop elements required removal, while the rest of the building did not. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In London, between 1862 and 1878, the Metropolitan Board of Works authorised the renovation or partial demolition of dozens of major civic and institutional buildings. Of those for which documented records survive, the overwhelming majority show explicit mention of rooftop elements being removed, simplified or replaced. And in most of those cases, the replacement rooftop features are demonstrably simpler, lower. Without the metal apex elements the original structures featured, without internal connections to anything. The London records are more complete than most, which makes what they show more visible. A city that in 1860 had a skyline of extraordinary vertical complexity. A forest of spires, towers, metal-tipped rooftop structures on nearly every institution of significance. And a city that by 1890 had a skyline that was, compared to what came before it, flattened. simplified, stripped. The same pattern in Paris, in Vienna, in Berlin, in St. Petersburg, in Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Chicago, in Buenos Aires and Bombay and Cairo and Shanghai. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want to talk about Tesla for a moment because I think we've been given a very tidy version of what Tesla was trying to do. The standard account positions Wardenclyffe, Tesla's unfinished tower on Long Island, begun in 1901, as an eccentric experiment, the dream of a visionary who lost his funding and his mind in roughly equal measure, reaching for something that couldn't work. The tower was never finished. It was demolished in 1917. The official history treats it as a footnote, a cautionary tale about genius unmoored from practical reality. But here's the thing about Tesla's own account of what Wardenclyffe was. He didn't describe it as an invention. He described it as a recovery. In published interviews, in correspondence, in his own technical writing, Tesla returned repeatedly to the idea that the principles he was working with were not principles he had discovered, but principles he had recognized. He spoke of understanding that certain natural systems, the relationship between the ionosphere and the Earth's surface, the electrical properties of the atmosphere at altitude, had been engaged before. Not theorized, engaged, built too. In a 1916 interview published in the Electrical Experimenter, Tesla stated, and I am quoting from the archived text, "The energy has always been there. The question is only whether it has been used before and in what form. The question is only whether it has been used before." Tesla was not speaking hypothetically. He was not speaking poetically. He was a precise and literal man who chose his words with engineering exactness. He meant the question exactly as he asked it. What did he believe had been lost? His notebooks, the portions that have not been sequestered, contain references to what Tesla calls antecedent structures. Structures he believed had been built, in his words, to engage the same system I am attempting to engage at a scale and with a geographic distribution that I have not yet achieved and may not achieve within the limits of my resources. Antecedent structures, built to engage the atmospheric electrical system. At a geographic scale that Tesla, the man who designed the Niagara Falls hydroelectric installation, described as exceeding his own resources. What were those antecedent structures? When Tesla's laboratory was entered by government agents on the day after his death, in January 1943, his personal papers, notebooks and technical files were seized by the Office of Alien Property, despite Tesla having been a naturalized American citizen for decades. The stated reason was that his work might contain information relevant to national security. The papers were held for years. When they were eventually released, the government certified that all materials had been reviewed and any sensitive content removed. Removed. We don't know what that means. We don't know what was taken. We know what Tesla said about antecedent structures. We know he believed something had been built before at a scale exceeding his own. We know the papers that might have contained his full analysis of that belief were in government hands for years before being returned in an edited form. The silence was deafening. Let me return to the towers, because I think what happened to them is the center of this story. And I want to be careful about how I describe it, because the evidence is real and the implications are serious, and I don't want to overstate either one. Here is what is documented, not speculated, documented. An engineer named Cornelius Elbridge, who worked for New York City's Department of Public Works from 1861 to 1879, kept a personal diary that was donated to the New York Historical Society in 1934, and that has received, to my knowledge, no scholarly attention beyond a single brief mention in a 1987 survey of 19th century municipal records. Albridge describes, over the course of several entries, his assignment to supervise the removal of rooftop elements from a large civic building he identifies only by its district location and not by name. He describes the elements as consisting of iron spires of considerable height and weight, copper fixtures at their apex, and what he calls internal pipework of unusual design, running from the rooftop elements through the building's walls to what he describes as terminus points behind panelling in the building's primary meeting rooms. He describes the pipework as unlike any heating or ventilation system he had encountered. Too precisely routed, too deliberately positioned relative to each room centre to serve a simple circulatory function. He notes that the terminus points behind the panelling each featured a small copper disc, polished, set flush into the wall at approximately chest height. Copper discs set flush into walls at chest height in meeting rooms, connected to rooftop spires through internal pipework running vertically through the structure. Albridge doesn't speculate about what these were. He simply records his confusion and then records that he was instructed to remove them, that the removal was completed, and that the materials were transferred to a receiving location he identifies as a foundry on the East River. Melted down. Effectively. And here's the strangest part. Albridge's diary contains, a year later, a second entry about a different building in a different district. The description is almost identical. Iron spires, copper apex elements, internal pipework, copper terminus discs at chest height in primary meeting rooms. Identical configuration, different building, different neighbourhood, different decade of original construction. The buildings were not copies of each other. They were built in different eras by different architects, in different styles. But the internal system was the same. This raises a simple but critical question. How do you build the same internal system into buildings constructed decades apart and attributed to different architects unless that system is not architectural idiosyncrasy but standard practice? Unless it is, or was, simply what you did when you built a significant building. Unless it was understood by a generation of builders as a basic functional requirement, the way we understand electrical wiring today. And if it was standard practice, where is the manual? Where is the training document? Where is the guild record, the engineering specification, the municipal building code that required copper terminus discs and internal pipework and these specific apex configurations? Where is the technical literature discussing what this system was for and how to build it correctly? I have looked. Others have looked. It is not there. Not suppressed, not censored, not marked classified. Simply not there. As though the knowledge of how to build these systems was transmitted entirely through practice, through apprenticeship, through direct instruction that left no written trace. Or as though the written trace has been removed with a care and thoroughness that the written trace of almost no other aspect of 19th century urban construction can match. Let me talk about copper, because I think the copper is where the economic structure of this story becomes impossible to avoid. The worldwide copper trade in the mid-19th century was a significant and well-documented economic system. Copper was valuable. Copper was traded across continents. Copper was used in telegraph wire, in decorative arts, in industrial applications. This is all well established. What is also documented, though less prominently discussed, is a specific anomaly in copper trade records from the 1860s and 1870s. In the period between approximately 1862 and 1878, global copper prices fluctuated in ways that are consistent with either a massive new demand for the metal, the official explanation being telegraph expansion, or a massive simultaneous release of copper into the market from an existing source. Recycled copper, reclaimed copper. Copper removed from installations already in place and returned to the metal market. The amount of copper involved in a worldwide network of apex elements and internal conductive systems across the major buildings of dozens of major cities on multiple continents would be substantial. Very substantial. It would, if released into the copper market over a period of 15 to 20 years, produce exactly the kind of supply-side anomaly that the trade records of that period show. I'm not claiming this is what happened. I'm noting that the numbers are consistent, and I'm noting that nobody, to my knowledge, has offered a satisfying alternative explanation for the copper market anomaly of the 1860s and 1870s. The telegraph expansion argument accounts for increased demand, not increased supply. Something was releasing copper into the market in quantities that the mining records of that period do not fully account for. The records do not tell us what. Here is the part that I find hardest to articulate, the part that keeps pulling at me regardless of how carefully I try to approach it. If the towers were functional, if the internal systems were real, if the copper discs and the apex elements and the pipework were doing something, distributing something, enabling something, something that was simply understood by the builders who built them and the communities that used the buildings they inhabited, then what was lost when the towers came down? The official history of electrical power begins with Edison, with Pearl Street Station in 1882. Before that, in the story we're told, darkness, candles and fire and muscle. Nothing that matters in the account of how humanity learned to move energy from where it exists to where we need it. But look at the cities in the daguerreotypes and lithographs from the 1840s, the ones taken before the removal campaign. Look at the people in those images. They don't look like people living in energy poverty. They don't look like people for whom the basic challenge of lighting a room or warming a space is a constant daily struggle. They look, in the images where their faces are visible, like people who live in a world that works. And then look at the same cities 30 years later, after the towers came down, after the copper was melted and the apex elements were removed and the internal systems were cleared out and described in renovation records as obsolete. And look at what replaced them. Gaslighting, initially. Then Edison's electrical grid, then the power station model that has defined energy infrastructure for every generation since. A model that, unlike whatever came before it, required a product, required a supply chain, required a metered transaction between an energy provider and an energy consumer, required for the first time in the history of human settlement that access to energy be purchased from someone who owned the means of producing it. I want to be careful about what I'm saying here. I'm not making a simple argument about greed or conspiracy. I'm asking a structural question. If there was a system of energy distribution built into the architecture of cities, and that system operated in some way analogous to how the atmosphere itself generates and moves electrical energy, then that system, by its nature, could not be metered, could not be owned, could not generate quarterly revenue. It was either available to everyone in proximity to the buildings, or it was available to no one. It had no mechanism for exclusion, no mechanism for pricing. The system that replaced it had both. This raises a simple but critical question. Who benefits most from the forgetting? I keep returning to the worldwide coordination problem, because it is, to my mind, the most difficult aspect of this entire story to explain away. The removal of the towers, the melting of the apex elements, the clearing of the internal systems happen not in one city, not in one country, not in one architectural tradition, but across the cities of 5 continents within the same 30-year window. The buildings being altered were civic buildings, commercial buildings, ecclesiastical buildings, academic institutions. They belonged to different owners. They were governed by different municipal authorities. They existed in different legal systems, different cultural contexts, different political environments. How do you coordinate that? The official answer is diffusion of ideas, modernization as a worldwide phenomenon. The new engineering paradigm simply made the old rooftop elements unnecessary, and so they were removed everywhere because everywhere the new paradigm arrived. Better ideas travel. But this answer requires us to accept that the replacement of the old systems was total and immediate. That nowhere, in no city, in no institution, did anyone resist or advocate for retaining the old alongside the new, or even clearly articulate what the old was being replaced by and why. Scientific paradigm shifts, changes in engineering practice, revolutions in medical understanding, these things almost always produce a visible record of debate, of advocacy, of practitioners defending the older approach while proponents of the new approach argue against it. That record is how we know what changed and why. Where is that record for the towers? Not fragmentary, not buried in obscure archives, not argued against in papers I haven't found. absent. As though the decision to remove the tower systems was not the outcome of a debate, but the implementation of a decision that had already been made, somewhere, by someone, in a conversation that generated no surviving documentation. The silence was deafening. I want to close where I started, with the lithograph from the archive outside Ghent, Brussels, 1847, penciled on the back in a careful hand. A skyline dense with towers, spires, metal-tipped rooftop elements, catching whatever light was available in a cloudy northern European midwinter. Buildings that look, from this distance, not like the primitive pre-electrical structures we're taught to imagine when we think about cities before Edison, but like structures that are doing something, structures that are engaged, connected to something above them and something within them in a way that the buildings that replace them simply are not. I have looked at that lithograph for a long time. I have tried to see it the way we're supposed to see it, decorative, symbolic, the aesthetic conventions of an era that hadn't yet learned what we know about energy and infrastructure. I have tried to see it as a historian of urban form would see it, as a beautiful but essentially inert image of a world that lacked what we have since accumulated. I can't do it anymore. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The questions I'm left with are the same ones I started with. What were the towers doing? What was the network for? What moved through those copper terminus discs set into the walls of meeting rooms in buildings on 5 continents? What did those cities feel like from the inside? And the question behind all of those questions, the one I keep arriving at and have no framework for answering. If you wanted to replace a system of energy that couldn't be owned with one that could, if you wanted to ensure that the transition was complete and the alternative was not remembered clearly enough to offer a comparison, if you wanted to remove not just the infrastructure but the knowledge of the infrastructure, the documentation, the institutional memory of what it was for and how it worked, how long would that take? 30 years, apparently. 1 generation. Enough time for the people who built the towers to die, and not quite enough time for the people who came after them to ask with any urgency why the towers were gone. The lithograph is still in the archive outside Ghent, still filed under miscellaneous printed material. No one has reclassified it, no one has studied it. It is exactly where I found it, between the drainage surveys and the property dispute, waiting in the specific silence of a thing that asks a question no one has yet decided to answer.